Picture this: you wake up in the morning, and there's no coffee waiting for you, no tea to soothe your nerves, no soda to fizz on your tongue, just silence and the faint echo of a world where every drink was a product of the earth and human creativity. That was life in the Bronze Age, a time when what you drank wasn't just about quenching thirst. It was a window into culture, survival, and even the divine. Today, we're stepping back into that world to uncover the secrets of ancient beverages, from the golden glow of fermented honey, wine to the hearty depth of early beer. But why should we care about drinks that vanished thousands of years ago? Because these liquids weren't just refreshments, they were the building blocks of history, shaping the way we brew, ferment, and even socialize today. Think about the last time you raised a glass with friends. Maybe it was a crisp beer or a rich wine. That moment connects you directly to the Bronze Age, where shared drinks sealed alliances, celebrated harvests, and honored the gods. These ancient concoctions were more than just hydration. They were rituals in liquid form. Take mead, for example, a drink made from honey, water, and thyme. It wasn't just sweet, it was sacred, often linked to myths and immortality. Or consider the early beers brewed by the Sumerians, so vital that they even had a goddess of beer, Ninkasi. These drinks weren't just stumbled upon, they were crafted with care, innovation, and a deep understanding of nature's gifts. So what can we learn from the drinking habits of our ancestors? For starters, their creativity with limited resources is astounding. No sugar, honey would do. No grapes, grains could be fermented. Every sip was a triumph of ingenuity. And here's the twist: some of these ancient recipes might surprise you with their sophistication. Imagine a world where beer was so valued it was used as currency, or where spiced wines were reserved for kings and priests. This isn't just history, it's a story of human connection, one that flows through time and into your glass today. So let's dive in, because the drinks of the Bronze Age aren't just relics. They're reminders of how far we've come and how much we still share with those who came before us. The Bronze Age wasn't just about metal, it was a revolution in what filled people's cups. Imagine living in a world where water could make you sick, but a frothy beer or tangy wine might save your life. That's why fermentation became more than tradition, it was survival. In Mesopotamia, workers building the great ziggurats received daily beer rations, part payment, part protection from disease. Over in ancient Egypt, beer was so essential it flowed in the afterlife, with tombs stocked like eternal taverns. But these drinks weren't just practical, they were threads woven into the fabric of society. Take the Minoans of Crete, who painted elaborate wine rituals on palace walls, showing how drinking ceremonies marked everything from trade deals to religious rites. Even children sometimes drank weak, watered-down beer, proving these beverages were as ordinary as bread. What's fascinating is how regional flavors emerged. While the Mesopotamians perfected beer using barley, the Greeks experimented with resin-flavored wines, storing them in clay amphorae that gave each batch a distinct earthy taste. Up north, the Celts brewed heather ale, so prized that recipes were guarded like state secrets. And let's not forget the nomadic tribes of the Eurasian steppes, fermenting mare's milk into Cumis, a tart, slightly alcoholic drink that packed nutrition for long journeys. These weren't just random experiments, they reflected local climates, crops, and even spiritual beliefs. The Hittites, for instance, considered beer a gift from the storm god Teshub, while Chinese aristocrats of the Shang dynasty toasted with millet wine to honor ancestors. But here's what truly connects us to these ancient drinkers, the communal magic of sharing a vessel. Bronze Age cultures from Britain to Babylon all understood that drinking together forged bonds. Archaeologists find traces of this in artifacts like the shared drinking horns of Scandinavia or the ornate wine cups buried with Mycenaean warriors. These objects tell us that raising a glass wasn't just about the liquid inside. It was about trust, celebration, and sometimes even diplomacy. When a Hittite king and Egyptian pharaoh sealed a peace treaty, they didn't shake hands, they drank from the same golden goblet. That's the power Bronze Age cultures understood. What we drink together, we become together. And isn't that still true today? Water might seem like the obvious choice for hydration, but in the Bronze Age, it came with hidden dangers. Rivers and streams that looked clear could harbor parasites or bacteria, and without modern filtration, a simple drink could lead to deadly illnesses. That's why many cultures treated water with caution, boiling it in clay pots or mixing it with safer alternatives like vinegar or wine to kill contaminants. The Minoans, masters of engineering, built intricate aqueducts and terracotta piping systems to channel fresh spring water into their palaces, proving that clean water was worth the effort. But even with these advancements, people often preferred fermented drinks, not just for flavor, but because the brewing process naturally made liquids safer to consume. Take the Indus Valley civilization, where archaeologists have found elaborate wells and reservoirs lined with bricks to keep water clean, or the ancient Egyptians, who strained water through cloth and stored it in porous clay jars that cooled it while filtering impurities. Yet despite these innovations, water was still a gamble, which is why beer and wine became the everyday staples. Fermentation acted as a natural preservative, killing harmful microbes while creating something flavorful and nutritious. It's a reminder that what we take for granted today, turning on a tap for a glass of safe water, was once a luxury, and in places where clean water was scarce, ingenuity flourished. The Hittites, for example, carved channels into mountainsides to collect runoff, while Chinese villages dug deep wells to avoid polluted surface water. But here's the fascinating twist. Even when water was risky, it held spiritual significance. Sacred springs across Europe and the Near East were believed to hold healing powers, often dedicated to gods or goddesses. In Celtic lands, offerings were tossed into wells as prayers for health, while the Greeks placed cups near natural springs as gifts to nymphs. This duality, water as both a threat and a blessing, shows how deeply our ancestors understood its power. They didn't just drink, they respected, purified, and sometimes even worshipped it. So the next time you sip a glass of water, remember, it wasn't always this simple. Behind every drop was centuries of trial, error, and reverence. Beer in the Bronze Age wasn't just a beverage, it was the lifeblood of entire civilizations. Picture a Sumerian laborer at the end of a grueling day building ziggurats, receiving not coins or credits, but a clay jar filled with rich, cloudy beer. This was currency you could drink, packed with calories and nutrients to fuel another day's work. The beer they brewed would surprise modern drinkers, thick enough to eat with a spoon, often flavored with herbs or fruit, and sipped through reeds to avoid the grainy sediment at the bottom of the vessel. Archaeologists have even found cuneiform tablets detailing precise recipes, showing how seriously the Mesopotamians took their brewing craft. But beer's importance went far beyond the practical. In temples across Sumer, priests poured libations of beer to honor the gods, believing the intoxicating effects brought them closer to the divine. The famous hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, wasn't just poetry, it was a practical brewing guide disguised as worship, passed down through generations. Over in Egypt, beer took on medicinal roles too. Medical papyri prescribed spiced beer for everything from digestive troubles to childbirth pains, while pyramid workers received daily rations of 3 to 5 liters, proof that beer built the ancient world as much as stone and sweat did. What's remarkable is how these early brewers worked with what they had. Without modern yeast strains, they relied on wild fermentation, using the same clay vessels for brewing, storage, and serving. Some batches might have tasted sour or funky by today's standards, but they were far safer than untreated water. The Egyptians even had specialized beer jars with pointed bottoms, designed to keep the liquid clear as sediment settled. And let's not forget the innovation like the date-infused brews of the Nile Valley, or the spiced beers flavored with juniper and coriander found across Europe. Yet for all its everyday importance, beer also marked special occasions. When a Babylonian merchant sealed a deal, contracts were signed over shared beer. When an Egyptian noble died, beer jars were placed in tombs for the afterlife. This duality, both common and sacred, shows how deeply fermented drinks were woven into Bronze Age life. So the next time you enjoy a cold one, remember, you're holding a tradition that once built cities, pleased gods, and crossed the boundary between this world and the next. Now, while beer fueled the plains of Mesopotamia and the banks of the Nile, another fermented treasure was flourishing in the hills and valleys: wine. Unlike thick, grainy beer, wine carried the essence of sun-ripened grapes, a luxury that would come to symbolize power and prestige across the ancient world. While beer was the drink of the common people, wine became the liquid gold of the Mediterranean, a symbol of wealth, power, and divine connection. The story of wine begins in the rugged Caucasus Mountains around 6000 BCE, where wild grapevines were first domesticated. But it was during the Bronze Age that winemaking truly blossomed, transforming from a regional craft into a cultural phenomenon. Picture the sun-drenched hills of ancient Greece, where terraced vineyards climbed the slopes, their grapes destined to become the prized drink of philosophers and kings. The Greeks didn't just drink wine, they celebrated it. To them, wine was a gift from Dionysus, the god of ecstasy and revelry, whose followers believed intoxication could bring them closer to the divine. But this wasn't about reckless drinking. Wine was a sacred art, often diluted with water and infused with herbs or honey to create complex flavors. Symposia, those legendary Greek drinking parties, weren't just feasts. They were intellectual gatherings where poetry, politics, and philosophy flowed as freely as the wine. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians, master traders of the ancient world, turned wine into a global commodity. Their ships carried amphorae, distinctive clay jars with pointed bottoms across the Mediterranean, spreading viticulture from Lebanon to Spain. These jars weren't just containers, they were marvels of design. Their shape allowed sediment to settle, and their clay pores let the wine breathe, aging it to perfection. Archaeologists have found Phoenician shipwrecks laden with thousands of these vessels, proof of a thriving trade that connected empires. In Egypt, wine took on a royal aura. While beer quenched the thirst of the masses, wine was reserved for pharaohs and high priests. Tomb paintings show elaborate banquets where guests sipped from golden cups, and jars of wine were buried with the dead to ensure luxury in the afterlife. Some of the oldest surviving wine labels inscribed on jars in King Tutankhamun's tomb even detail the vintage, vineyard, and winemaker's name. That's how seriously the Egyptians took their wine. But here's what's fascinating. Wine wasn't just about pleasure or status. It was medicine, ritual, and even diplomacy. Hittite kings sent wine as gifts to foreign rulers, while Minoan priests used it in ceremonies to honor their goddesses. And let's not forget the practical side. Wine's acidity made it safer to drink than water in many coastal cities, where contamination was a constant threat. So why did wine captivate the Bronze Age world? Maybe because it captured sunlight in a bottle, the taste of ripe grapes, the warmth of shared cups, the promise of connection to something greater. And as vineyards spread, so did the stories, the trade routes, and the very idea of civilization itself. But for those who craved something sweeter, there was another ancient drink waiting in the wings, one made not from grapes but from the labor of bees. Before grapes or grains, there was honey, golden, rare, and powerful enough to ferment into the world's oldest known alcoholic drink. Mead wasn't just a beverage, it was liquid mythology, sipped by everyone from Viking warriors to Chinese emperors. Picture a drink so precious that serving it meant you were offering a piece of the divine. Honey was scarce, often gathered from wild hives at great risk, which made every drop of mead a celebration in itself. The Celts believed it held magical properties, while Norse legends claimed the god Odin gained his wisdom from a stolen sip of the poet's mead. Even in ancient China, jars of honey wine were buried with nobles to sweeten their journey into the afterlife. But mead was more than just a drink, it was a cultural touchstone. In Celtic weddings, couples shared a ceremonial cup of mead for a full moon cycle to ensure fertility, giving us the term honeymoon. Anglo-Saxon chieftains sealed treaties over honeyed cups, and Baltic tribes offered it to their gods during solstice festivals. The variations were endless, some brewed with tart berries for brightness, others infused with aromatic herbs like thyme or meadowsweet. Archaeologists have found traces of these ingredients in Bronze Age drinking vessels, revealing recipes lost for millennia. Yet here's the twist: mead's sweetness wasn't just for pleasure. In a world without sugar, honey was medicine. The Greeks mixed it into healing tonics, while Germanic tribes used mead to disinfect wounds. Its antibacterial properties, combined with alcohol's preservative power, made it both nourishing and safe. But the real magic lay in its symbolism. When a Viking lord raised a horn of mead in his feasting hall, he wasn't just drinking, he was weaving community, invoking ancestors, and staking his reputation on the quality of his brew. Now, while honey was the original sweetener, Bronze Age innovators discovered another source of fermentable sugar-ripe, sun-warmed fruit. From the orchards of Mesopotamia to the hills of ancient Greece, wild grapes, plums, and pomegranates were left to bubble into rustic wines. Unlike mead, these drinks carried the taste of the land itself, each sip a reflection of soil and season. And that's where our story takes a juicy turn. Long before vineyards covered the Mediterranean hillsides, resourceful Bronze Age fermenters were turning whatever fruits grew nearby into something magical. Picture a world where every orchard and hedgerow held potential, where pomegranates bursting with ruby seeds could become a Tartessian king's prized drink, and wild apples left to ferment in oak barrels transformed into the Celts' beloved cider. These weren't just substitutes for grape wine, they were traditions in their own right, shaped by the land and the seasons. Take the pomegranate wines of ancient Iberia, where the Tartessians crushed the fruits jewel-like arrows and let the juice ferment in clay vessels buried underground. The result, a vibrant, tangy drink that stained drinking cups crimson and likely carried a pleasant fizz from natural carbonation. Over in Britain and Gaul, apples were the star. Celtic tribes didn't just stumble upon cider, they cultivated specific apple varieties for brewing, some so bitter they were inedible raw but perfect for fermentation. Archaeologists have found evidence of massive apple presses in northern Europe, suggesting cider production was a serious enterprise centuries before the Romans arrived. But fruit wines weren't just about taste, they solved practical problems. In cooler climates where grapes struggled, fermented apples and berries became a way to preserve precious summer harvests through harsh winters. The Phoenicians, ever the traders, carried fig wine across the Mediterranean, while the Minoans experimented with quince and pear fermentations. These drinks would have tasted wildly different from modern versions, often watered down, sometimes spiked with honey for sweetness, and always carrying the earthy tang of wild yeast. What's fascinating is how these beverages mirrored their environments. A sip of Thracian blackberry wine would have carried the essence of sun-warmed Balkan hillsides, while Anatolian plum wine might have been infused with mountain herbs. Even the vessels' matted oak barrels gave Celtic ciders a woody depth, while porous clay amphorae allowed Armenian apricot wines to breathe and develop complexity. Yet beyond flavor, these drinks held social power. Sharing a cup of pomegranate wine in Tartessos might have sealed a marriage alliance, while Norse sagas mention apple cider fueling midwinter feasts where oaths were sworn. Unlike grape wine's elite associations, fruit ferments often belonged to the people, a democratic luxury that required no royal vineyards, just patience and knowledge passed down through generations. Now, imagine the surprise of a Bronze Age traveler tasting these regional specialties for the first time, the shock of a Phoenician merchant encountering Nordic cloudberry wine, or a Greek sailor trying Egyptian date wine. These drinks weren't just refreshments, they were passports to the diversity of the ancient world. And speaking of surprises, our next stop might be the most unexpected yet, because not all Bronze Age drinks came from plants. Some came from creatures that walked, grazed, and produced milk. Milk in the Bronze Age wasn't the simple, shelf-stable carton we know today. It was a living, changing substance, as unpredictable as the animals that produced it. For nomadic tribes roaming the steppes of Central Asia, fresh milk was a fleeting luxury. But through fermentation, they unlocked something extraordinary. Cumis, a lightly alcoholic drink made from mare's milk, fizzy and tart like a primitive yogurt soda. This wasn't just a clever way to preserve milk. It was a nutritional powerhouse packed with probiotics that aided digestion and provided vital nutrients during long treks across harsh landscapes. The Scythians, fierce horse lords of the Eurasian plains, even believed Cumis bestowed strength and courage, sharing it in ceremonial cups during tribal gatherings. But here's the catch: not everyone could enjoy dairy's benefits. Lactose intolerance was widespread, with genetic studies revealing that many Bronze Age Europeans and Asians lacked the enzyme to digest milk sugar properly. So how did some cultures rely so heavily on dairy? Through a remarkable biological adaptation. Over generations, populations like the Yamnaya herders of the Pontic-Caspian steppe evolved genetic mutations allowing them to process lactose into adulthood, a trait that spread like wildfire as dairy farming expanded. Meanwhile, others found workarounds. Fermenting milk into cheese or yogurt reduced lactose content, making it tolerable for more people. Beyond the steppes, dairy took on surprising forms. In the Alps, ancient herders stored milk in wooden vessels lined with beneficial bacteria, creating early versions of cheese. The Indus Valley civilization left behind strainers possibly used to separate curds and whey, while Egyptian tomb paintings show workers milking cows into pottery jars, evidence of a thriving dairy culture along the Nile. Yet for all its versatility, milk was never universal. In regions like Mesoamerica or East Asia, where lactose intolerance remained high, people turned to other sources of nourishment like nut milks or fermented soy. Now imagine the sensory experience of these ancient dairy drinks. Cumis would have bubbled slightly, carrying the grassy tang of mare's milk and the wild yeast of the open steppe. Butter, churned in animal skins, might have been infused with smoky flavors from preservation techniques. And cheese, each batch was a roll of the dice, its taste shaped by whatever microbes lived in the brewer's clay pots or wooden tubs. But milk wasn't the only liquid remedy brewing in Bronze Age kitchens. While some cultures raised drinking horns filled with Cumis, others turned to the earth's greenery, steeping leaves, roots, and flowers into herbal infusions that healed, energized, or even altered consciousness. From the peat bogs of northern Europe to the sun-baked hills of Anatolia, every landscape offered its own botanical bounty, and with it, a new way to fill the cup. While we might associate tea with neatly packaged leaves today, Bronze Age herbal brews were wilder affairs, improvised medicines and comforting drinks plucked straight from hillsides and riverbanks. Picture a Hittite healer gathering fragrant thyme at dawn, knowing its steam could soothe a cough, or an Egyptian mother steeping chamomile flowers to calm a restless child. These weren't just beverages, they were pharmacies in a cup crafted from knowledge passed down through generations. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts from ancient Egypt, lists over 800 herbal remedies, many of which involved boiling plants like myrrh or frankincense into potent infusions. But herbal brews weren't just practical, they carried spiritual weight. In China, early tea ceremonies honored ancestors, while Celtic druids brewed mistletoe infusions under full moons for rituals. The Greeks believed mint could clear the mind for prophecy, and Babylonian priests burned herbs like sage to purify temple air before drinking their own medicinal teas. What's fascinating is how universal these practices were, even without shared knowledge. From the peppery yarrow teas of Scandinavia to the lavender infusions of Crete, people everywhere discovered that hot water could unlock the hidden powers of plants. Now, here's something modern tea drinkers might find surprising. Many of these ancient brews weren't steeped for flavor alone. Pine needle tea, popular among Nordic and Siberian tribes, provided vital vitamin C during long winters, a primitive defense against scurvy. Willow bark tea, bitter but effective, offered pain relief thanks to its natural salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin. Even simple nettle tea, still drunk today, was a nutritional powerhouse, rich in iron and antioxidants. But perhaps the most unexpected ingredient in the Bronze Age herbalist's toolkit wasn't a leaf or flower at all. It was the sticky resin oozing from tree bark. Across the Mediterranean, healers collected mastic sap from pistachio trees, chewing it for oral health or dissolving it in hot water for stomach ailments. The Egyptians prized frankincense resin not just for incense but as a tea to treat inflammation, while Baltic tribes brewed birch sap into a slightly sweet spring tonic. These tree-derived drinks blurred the line between food and medicine, proving that ancient people saw their entire landscape as a source of healing. So next time you sip a cup of herbal tea, remember, you're part of a tradition that once connected the Hittite healer, the Greek oracle, and the Celtic druid, all united by the simple magic of hot water and the right plants. And speaking of magic, there's one more Bronze Age beverage that defies expectations, made not from leaves or sap, but from something even more unexpected in the vast northern forests where winter's grip lasted for months. Bronze Age communities discovered a remarkable springtime treasure, the rising sap of birch trees. As the snow melted and days grew longer, people would carefully notch the pale bark, collecting the clear, slightly sweet liquid that dripped into waiting containers. This wasn't just water. It was nature's energy drink, loaded with vitamins, minerals, and natural sugars after a season of scarcity. The Lapp and Finno-Ugric peoples of Scandinavia and Siberia saw birch sap as both nourishment and medicine, drinking it fresh to cleanse the body after long winters or fermenting it into a lightly bubbly, low-alcohol beverage that tasted of the forest itself. What made birch sap so special was its fleeting availability. This liquid gold only flowed for a few weeks each spring. Archaeologists have found evidence of birch bark containers and wooden taps dating back thousands of years, showing how systematically these early foragers harvested the sap. Some groups even flavored it with juniper berries or wild herbs, creating variations that might have been the ancestors of modern kvass. And birch wasn't alone. Maple trees in North America were tapped by indigenous peoples, though their sap's higher sugar content made it better suited for syrup than fermentation. Now imagine the surprise of a Bronze Age traveler encountering fermented birch sap for the first time. The gentle fizz, the woody aftertaste, the way a drink made from trees could carry the essence of an entire season. This wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was about celebrating renewal, the first tangible sign that life was returning to the frozen world. But trees weren't the only unexpected source of ancient drinks. Along coastal regions and river settlements, another fermentation tradition was bubbling away, one that might make modern palates pause. Fish, packed tightly in pits or barrels with salt and herbs, would break down into a pungent, protein-rich liquid that some cultures drank as a fortifying tonic. The Norse called this gamel, while Baltic tribes fermented fish guts into a sharp, umami-loaded brew believed to boost strength. These fish ferments walked the line between food and drink, often thinned with water or mixed with herbs to balance their intense flavor. What connected birch sap and fish brews was ingenuity, the ability to see potential where others saw only trees or scraps. Whether sipping the first sweetness of spring or extracting nourishment from every part of a catch, Bronze Age people knew that survival meant listening to the land and sometimes drinking what it offered in the most surprising forms. Fermented fish sauces might seem like an unlikely beverage today, but in the Bronze Age, these pungent, salty liquids blurred the line between condiment and drink. Take garum, the Roman Empire's beloved fish sauce, which started as a coastal innovation centuries earlier. Picture this: fishermen in ancient Phoenicia or Greece packing anchovies and mackerel into clay pots with layers of salt, then leaving them to ferment under the sun for months. The result, a briny, amber-colored liquid so packed with umami flavor that it was diluted with water or wine and sipped like a savory tonic. But why would anyone drink fish sauce? Beyond its rich taste, it was a nutritional powerhouse loaded with protein, electrolytes, and probiotics from fermentation. In coastal communities from the Mediterranean to Southeast Asia, where fresh water was often unsafe, fermented fish brine provided essential minerals and hydration. The Vietnamese ancestor of modern fish sauce, known as N-1, base 0-1 DBC M-1 AFM, likely began this way, while the Carthaginians traded amphorae of their own fish brews across North Africa. Even the Vikings had their version, a fermented fish drink called surströmming, that packed enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy on long sea voyages. What's fascinating is how these fish ferments became cultural signatures. The Greeks prized garum aged in specific coastal caves, while Southeast Asian versions incorporated regional ingredients like tamarind or palm sugar. Some were so valuable they became trade commodities. A single shipment of premium garum could fetch the price of fine wine in Rome's markets. And here's the twist: these drinks weren't just for the poor. Elite Roman banquets featured vintage garum served in delicate glass vessels, proof that fermented fish could be as sophisticated as any wine. Yet for all their popularity, fish beverages had limits. Inland communities often found the taste overwhelming, preferring milder brews like beer or fruit wines. And without refrigeration, spoilage was a constant risk, though clever solutions emerged, like mixing the brine with honey or herbs as natural preservatives. Now imagine the bustling harbors of the Bronze Age, where ships laden with amphorae of garum, olive oil, and wine crisscrossed the Mediterranean. These fermented fish brews weren't just local oddities, they were part of a vast, interconnected trade network that shaped economies and diets across continents. And that's where our story heads next. The Bronze Age didn't just ferment drinks. It bottled entire economies inside clay amphorae. Picture a Phoenician merchant ship rocking on Mediterranean waves, its hull stacked with hundreds of pointed jars, each one stamped with symbols indicating its origin, vintage, and even the vineyard's name. These weren't just containers, they were Bronze Age barcodes carrying the taste of distant lands to thirsty ports from Tyre to Tartessos. The Minoans of Crete perfected this trade, exporting their finest wines in sleek, painted amphorae that doubled as status symbols. Finding one in an Egyptian tomb was like discovering a vintage Bordeaux buried with a pharaoh. But trade did more than move liquids, it transformed them. When Mycenaean Greeks encountered Egyptian date wine, they began infusing their own vintages with exotic spices. Phoenician traders introduced resin-flavored wines to North Africa, where local brewers adapted the technique using acacia gum. Even something as simple as the shape of a drinking cup could spark innovation. The elegant stemware of Cyprus inspired potters from Sardinia to Syria, creating a ripple effect of design trends as far-reaching as modern coffee culture. Yet the most surprising trade item wasn't wine or beer, it was olive oil. Pressed from orchards in Crete and the Levant, oil traveled in the same amphorae as wine, sometimes repurposed as lubricant for shipbuilding or fuel for lamps. But in places like Bronze Age Canaan, archaeologists have found oil jars with residue suggesting they once held spiced herbal infusions, an ancient version of today's flavored oils. This crossover between kitchen and cellar shows how trade blurred boundaries, turning everyday staples into luxury goods. Beyond commerce, these liquid cargoes carried something intangible: ideas. When a Hittite noble sipped Minoan wine, he wasn't just tasting grapes, he absorbed Crete's artistry through the painted scenes on his cup. A sip of Egyptian beer in a Mycenaean palace might inspire new brewing techniques, while Phoenician wine rituals introduced foreign gods to distant shores. The spiritual significance traveled with the trade. Libation vessels found in Sardinian tombs mimic Levantine designs, proof that drinking customs could cross seas as easily as ships. What emerges is a world where every amphora held layers of meaning: economic, cultural, even divine. The same Phoenician ship might carry wine for a king's banquet, oil for a temple ceremony, and beer for sailors' rations. This complexity reminds us that Bronze Age trade wasn't just about goods. It was about the stories, skills, and beliefs poured into every vessel. And as these liquids mingled in foreign ports, they did something remarkable. They turned strangers into neighbors, one shared cup at a time. For the people of the Bronze Age, pouring a drink wasn't just an act of hospitality. It was a bridge to the gods. Picture a Sumerian priest carefully filling a temple altar with frothy beer, believing the intoxicating vapor would rise like incense to please the deities. Or Greek worshippers tipping fine wine onto the earth as an offering to Dionysus, watching the dark liquid seep into the soil like a promise returned to the harvest. These weren't just rituals, they were sacred conversations with alcohol as the medium. The connection between intoxication and the divine ran deep across cultures. Norse legends spoke of the mead of poetry, a magical brew that gifted skalds with inspiration straight from the gods. In India, the Rigveda hymns praised Soma, a mysterious drink so potent it supposedly granted visions of immortality. Scholars still debate whether it was made from psychedelic mushrooms, ephedra, or another mind-altering plant. Even the Egyptians believed beer flowed in the afterlife, with the goddess Hathor sometimes called the Lady of Drunkenness for her role in joyful, ecstatic worship. But why alcohol? Because its effects lowered inhibitions, euphoria. Even hallucinations felt supernatural to ancient minds. A tipsy priest might interpret slurred speech as divine possession, while shared intoxication created collective spiritual experiences. The Hittites took this seriously, recording precise recipes for ceremonial beers brewed with sacred herbs, while Minoan frescoes show women in trance-like states holding ritual cups, possibly filled with wine laced with opium or other psychoactive additives. The tools of these sacred drinks were just as significant as the liquids themselves. A Mycenaean gold chalice wasn't just a cup, it was a vessel for communing with the dead, often placed in tombs to ensure the deceased could drink with ancestors. Celtic cauldrons, like the famed Gundestrup example, may have been used to mix hallucinogenic brews for druidic rites. Even the shape of drinking horns, so common from Scandinavia to Thrace, mirrored the crescent moon, a symbol of cyclical renewal. What's striking is how these rituals blurred boundaries. A Babylonian merchant might toast a business deal with the same beer used in temple offerings, while a Greek symposium could shift from philosophical debate to Dionysian ecstasy with just a few more cups. This duality, sacred and social, shows how deeply drink was woven into the fabric of belief. Now, imagine holding one of these ancient vessels, feeling its weight, tracing the patterns meant to ward off evil spirits or invoke blessings. The craftsmanship tells its own story. The cup you drank from in the Bronze Age wasn't just a container, it was a statement. Imagine a Mycenaean warlord raising a golden rhyton shaped like a lion's head, the wine glinting as it poured through the beast's open jaws. This wasn't just a drinking horn, it was a symbol of power crafted to intimidate guests and honor the gods. Yet at the same time, a farmer in the same kingdom might sip beer from a rough clay mug, its surface unadorned but sturdy enough to survive daily use. The gap between these vessels tells us more than just who could afford gold. It reveals how deeply drinking culture was tied to identity, artistry, and even politics. Take those famous gold rhytons of the Mycenaean elite. Shaped like bulls, griffins, or rams, these ceremonial cups weren't meant for casual use. They appeared in feasts where power was negotiated, their designs echoing myths and conquests. Pouring wine from one was a performance, demanding skill to avoid spills, a subtle test of a guest's composure. Meanwhile, across the Aegean, Minoan artisans painted clay cups with octopuses and dolphins, turning everyday objects into miniature masterpieces. Even common drinking vessels had personality, their patterns reflecting local tastes, from the geometric zigzags of Anatolia to the floral motifs of Egypt. But functionality mattered just as much as beauty. In Mesopotamia, where beer was thick with sediment, drinkers used long reed straws, sometimes decorated with lapis lazuli, to sip from shared jars without swallowing bitter grain residue. Archaeologists have found straws buried in royal tombs, some even featuring built-in filters. And let's not forget the humble wooden tankards of Northern Europe, lined with beeswax to prevent leaks, or the leather drinking pouches carried by nomads, flexible enough to strap to a saddle. Storage was another art altogether. Amphorae, those iconic clay jars with pointed bottoms, weren't just for show. Their shape allowed them to be stacked snugly in ship hulls or buried in cool cellar floors. The Phoenicians took this further, sealing wine with resin to preserve it during long sea voyages, while the Egyptians coated beer jars in plaster to keep contents fresh. Some cultures got creative. In the Caucasus, winemakers used enormous buried clay vessels called cuve, where grapes fermented underground at stable temperatures, a technique still used today. What's remarkable is how these containers crossed borders. A Hittite trader might sip from a Cypriot cup while selling Egyptian beer stored in a Canaanite amphora, proof that drinking connected people across vast distances. And sometimes the vessels themselves became gifts. When a Babylonian king sent a carved obsidian goblet to an Assyrian ruler, it wasn't just a present, it was diplomacy in solid form. So the next time you hold a glass, think of the Bronze Age artisan who shaped its ancestor, whether from clay, wood, or precious metal, because every cup then and now carries more than liquid, it holds history in its curves. Keeping drinks fresh in the Bronze Age required equal parts innovation and intuition. Take those iconic amphorae, their pointed bottoms weren't just for stacking on ships. Buried halfway into cool earthen floors, the clay's porous nature allowed evaporation, creating a natural refrigeration effect that could preserve wine for years. The Greeks took this further, storing amphorae in deep underground cellars where temperatures remained constant, some even lining them with pine resin to add flavor while preventing leaks. But the real masters of preservation were the Phoenicians, who coated the insides of their wine jars with a thick layer of resin that acted like an ancient version of today's airtight seals. Leather bags, often made from goat or sheep hides, offered portable solutions for nomadic cultures. The Scythians would hang these from their saddles, letting the constant motion keep fermented mare's milk from separating. Meanwhile, in the Nile Delta, Egyptians discovered that sealing beer jars with a layer of wet clay, then letting it dry in the sun, created a vacuum effect that could keep brews drinkable for months. Some tomb excavations have revealed beer jars still containing traces of their contents after 3,000 years, though we can only imagine how those flavors evolved over millennia. The question of shelf life reveals surprising sophistication. While most beers were consumed fresh within weeks of brewing, certain wines were deliberately aged. Shipwrecks like the one at Uluburan off the Turkish coast held amphorae of Canaanite wine estimated to be 5 or 6 years old when they sank. These weren't accidents. Inscriptions on jars from Crete specify vintages, suggesting some wines were prized for maturity. The Romans later wrote about Falernian wine aging for decades, but Bronze Age cellars show this practice started much earlier. Now let's tackle some myths. Contrary to popular belief, not all ancient beer was cloudy, and bitter chemical analysis of Egyptian brewing vats reveals they sometimes used dates to sweeten their brews. And while Hollywood loves showing barbarians chugging from horns, many cultures diluted their drinks with water or herbs to moderate intoxication, the idea that everyone was constantly drunk. Another exaggeration, these were controlled substances. Often rationed workers got measured beer portions, and symposium wine was mixed with water in precise ratios. Perhaps the biggest misconception is that preservation was primitive. From the beeswax-lined barrels of Celtic brewers to the snow-packed ice pits of Anatolian winemakers, Bronze Age techniques rivaled modern methods in ingenuity, just without the technology. The next time you twist open a bottle cap, remember, the quest to keep drinks fresh is as old as civilization itself. When we picture Bronze Age drinking habits, it's easy to assume everyone was tipsy from dawn till dusk, swilling strong beers or gulping undiluted wine. But the truth is far more nuanced. While alcohol played a significant role, water was still the most basic beverage, especially from protected sources like springs or wells. Herbal infusions made from mint, chamomile, or thyme were everyday staples, offering hydration without intoxication. Even children drank these brews along with lightly fermented, small beers that contained barely any alcohol, more like modern kombucha than today's craft brews. Take the famous Greek symposium, often depicted as a rowdy drinking party. What many don't realize is that wine was typically mixed with water in ratios as high as 1 part wine to 3 parts water, a far cry from the undiluted excess we imagine. Spartan law even mandated this dilution, considering pure wine barbaric. Similarly, Mesopotamian beer was frequently thinned with water or flavored with dates for sweetness, creating a nourishing but mild drink. Archaeologists analyzing residue from ancient drinking vessels have found evidence of these practices, proving moderation was often the norm. Health considerations shaped these choices too. While beer provided calories and nutrients, excessive alcohol consumption was recognized as problematic even then. Egyptian medical papyri warn against overindulgence, prescribing remedies for hangovers and liver ailments. The Ebers Papyrus recommends a morning after tonic of crushed juniper berries and honey, an ancient recognition that balance mattered. Meanwhile, herbal teas weren't just pleasant alternatives, they were medicine. Sage infusions treated sore throats, willow bark tea eased pain, and fermented dairy drinks like Cumis delivered gut-friendly probiotics long before modern science understood their benefits. The real surprise, how carefully ancient cultures managed alcohol's effects. Hittite texts describe tavern keepers being punished for overserving, while Greek philosophers praised wine's ability to inspire conversation, but only when consumed in measured amounts. Even the Norse, famous for their mead halls, valued ritualized drinking customs that emphasized storytelling and oath-making over mere intoxication. So next time you hear that the Bronze Age was one long bender, remember, our ancestors were far more sophisticated drinkers than myth suggests. They understood that what filled their cups could heal or harm, unite or divide, and that wisdom still resonates in every glass we raise today. Fermented drinks in the Bronze Age walked a fine line between nourishment and danger, a balancing act as old as civilization itself. While that thick, grainy beer kept Mesopotamian laborers fueled with calories and gut-friendly bacteria, we now know their brewing equipment could harbor unseen threats. Archaeologists have found traces of mold and harmful microbes in ancient beer residues, especially when fermentation vessels weren't properly cleaned. Imagine a batch left too long in the sun. What started as nourishing brew could turn into a stomach-churning hazard. Yet for all its risks, beer's boiling process still made it safer than untreated water in crowded cities where contamination spread quickly. The Romans learned a harder lesson about tainted drinks, one etched in lead pipes and poisoned wine cups. Their obsession with sweetening wine had a deadly side effect. By boiling grape syrup in lead-lined pots, they unwittingly created a neurotoxin that seeped into every sip. Some historians argue this contributed to Rome's decline, with aristocrats suffering chronic lead poisoning from decades of sipping their favorite vintages. But not all ancient health risks came from ingredients. In Egypt, beer jars sometimes carried traces of sand and grit from the Nile, wearing down drinkers' teeth over time, a trade-off for hydration in a land where clean water was scarce. Yet for every danger, there was a remedy hiding in these ancient brews. Mead's natural antibacterial properties made it a wound cleanser for Celtic warriors, while fermented mare's milk delivered probiotics long before modern medicine understood gut health. The Greeks prescribed wine mixed with herbs for everything from digestion to insomnia, and Mesopotamian doctors used beer as a base for pain-relieving potions. Even the humble birch sap drink of northern tribes packed a vitamin C punch that staved off scurvy during harsh winters. What's striking is how regional challenges shaped these health trade-offs. In malaria-prone areas, the slight acidity of wine or beer may have offered some protection against waterborne parasites. Meanwhile, alpine herders relied on fermented dairy to preserve milk's nutrients without refrigeration. Each culture's drinks weren't just about taste, they were survival solutions tailored to local environments. Now, picture two Bronze Age healers, one Egyptian, one Celtic, comparing their medicinal brews. The Egyptian reaches for a garlic-infused beer to treat heart ailments, while the Celt swears by willow bark mead for fever relief. Though separated by continents, both understood what modern science confirms: fermentation could unlock nature's pharmacy. But as we'll see next, these drinks didn't just heal bodies. They shaped entire cultures in ways as distinct as the landscapes they came from. The story of Bronze Age drinks isn't one tale, it's dozens, each shaped by the land that birthed them. While Mediterranean cultures toasted with wine under olive trees along the Yangtze River, artisans stirred bubbling vats of millet wine, its golden hue mirroring the rice paddies that stretched to the horizon. This wasn't just a difference in taste, it was a reflection of how geography wrote the recipe books of history. In China's Shang dynasty, bronze vessels inscribed with glyphs for fermented grain held drinks reserved for rituals honoring ancestors, their recipes guarded as closely as state secrets. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the Moch people of Peru brewed chicha from purple corn, chewing the kernels to activate enzymes that kick-started fermentation, a technique passed down through generations of brewers, mostly women, who held revered status in their communities. What's fascinating is how climate dictated these choices. Grapevines thrived in Mediterranean soils but withered in the monsoon rains of Southeast Asia, where rice became the backbone of fermentation. The Indus Valley, with its lush sugarcane fields, pioneered early versions of fermented cane juice, a precursor to today's rum, while the chilly steppes of Mongolia favored warming mare's milk brews. Even storage methods diverged. Chinese aristocrats buried clay jars of rice wine to age like fine vintages, while Andean cultures used frost-resistant straw vessels to keep chicha cool in mountain villages. But regional drinks weren't just about survival, they became cultural fingerprints. Japanese texts describe sake being offered to gods at Shinto shrines, its clarity symbolizing purity. In contrast, the frothy, maize-based pozole of Mesoamerica was so valued that Spanish conquistadors noted its use as emergency rations for warriors. The spices tell another story. While Greek wines might be infused with thyme from sun-baked hills, Indian soma, whatever its mysterious ingredients, reportedly glowed like molten gold, laced with peppercorns and honey to mask its pungency. Trade added another layer to this diversity. When Mesopotamian merchants brought date wine to the Indus Valley, locals experimented with blending it with sugarcane, creating hybrid flavors. The Phoenicians, sailing west, introduced grapevines to Iberia, where Celtic tribes later mixed the fruit with wild apples for a tart, effervescent cider wine. Yet some traditions resisted outside influence entirely, like the sacred chicha of the Andes, which never adopted Old World grains even after contact, remaining stubbornly, beautifully local. Why does this matter? Because every sip was a vote for what a culture cherished. The rice wines of East Asia celebrated agricultural precision, their clarity reflecting Confucian ideals of harmony. Nordic meads, dark and resinous, carried the wildness of untamed forests. From the palm wines of Africa to the fermented yak milk of Tibet, drinks became liquid maps plotting not just where people lived but who they aspired to be. The drinks we enjoy today are more than just modern inventions, they're living echoes of the Bronze Age, reshaped by time but still carrying the essence of ancient craftsmanship. Take mead, once the drink of Norse gods and Celtic kings, now reborn in hipster bars with flavors like hibiscus or chili-infused honey. Or consider beer, its DNA tracing straight back to those thick, spoonable Sumerian brews, though today's IPAs would baffle a Mesopotamian brewer with their hoppy bite. Even wine, while still pressed from grapes, has traded resin-lined amphorae for temperature-controlled steel tanks. What's fascinating isn't just their survival, but how little the core techniques have changed. Modern brewers still rely on fermentation, just as the Hittites did, though now we understand the science behind those bubbling vats. The clay cuve, every vessels used in Georgia today are nearly identical to those buried in Bronze Age cellars, proving some methods are timeless. Herbal teas, they've jumped from Bronze Age medicine cabinets to supermarket shelves, though the chamomile in your bedtime blend might startle an Egyptian healer with its neat tea bag packaging. Yet two forces have transformed these ancient drinks beyond recognition: technology and globalization. Where a Bronze Age brewer might pray to Ninkasi for a successful batch, today's labs can analyze yeast strains down to their DNA. Globalization means the juniper berries once foraged by Nordic tribes now flavor gin worldwide, while spices like cinnamon, once worth their weight in gold, are pantry staples. Even the humblest supermarket beer owes its consistency to industrial pasteurization, a far cry from the ever-changing flavors of ancient brews. But here's the real magic: despite all these advances, the soul of these drinks remains. When you sip a craft mead or swirl a glass of natural wine, you're tasting something deeper than chemistry. You're connecting to the same human impulses that led a Minoan artisan to paint dolphins on a wine cup, or a Celtic druid to harvest mistletoe at the full moon. Now, let's bridge the gap between past and present by recreating a drink that hasn't touched human lips for millennia. Picture this: a Sumerian beer, brewed from barley bread, dates, and wild yeast, unfiltered and cloudy as the Tigris River. The recipe, preserved in a 4,000-year-old hymn to the goddess Ninkasi, part prayer, part brewing manual. We'll toast to history, one ancient sip at a time. Ever wondered what it would be like to sip the same honeyed mead as a Viking warrior, or taste the barley beer that fueled pyramid builders? Thanks to archaeology, we can crack open the recipe books of the past, no time machine required. Let's start with mead, the simplest yet most storied of Bronze Age drinks. All you'll need is raw honey, water, and patience, no fancy equipment. Mix 1 part honey to 4 parts warm water in a clay pot or glass jar, stirring until the honey dissolves. Then leave it uncovered for a day to let wild yeast from the air work its magic, just as Celtic brewers did under oak trees centuries ago. Cover it with a cloth, secure it with string, and wait. Within weeks, bubbles will rise lazily to the surface, signaling fermentation is alive. This isn't just brewing, it's catching history in a jar. For beer, the process gets more hands-on. Sumerian tablets describe bapia, a barley bread baked twice to preserve it, then crumbled into water to start fermentation. To recreate this, toast barley flour cakes until they're dark and brittle, then soak them in water with crushed dates for sweetness. Forget stainless steel fermenters, use a wide-mouthed clay pot, just like those found in Mesopotamian ruins. The trick: skim off the floating grain with a reed straw, imitating the ancient practice of drinking from communal jars while avoiding sediment. Your brew will be cloudy and potent, closer to a porridge than modern lager, but that's the point. You're tasting liquid archaeology. Now, how do we know these recipes work? Archaeologists use chemistry as their time capsule. Gas chromatography can detect traces of tartaric acid in ancient jars, proving wine was stored there. Residue analysis on Bronze Age strainers reveals barley and wheat compounds, while pollen trapped in pottery tells us which flowers flavored mead. At a dig in Germany, scientists even found a 3,000-year-old birch bark bucket with remnants of a fermented birch sap and honey mix, a recipe now recreated by experimental brewers. But here's the real challenge: embracing imperfection. Your mead might taste funky from wild yeast strains, or your beer could turn sour without modern sanitizers. That's not failure, it's authenticity. Bronze Age drinks were alive, unpredictable, and deeply tied to their environment. When you sip your homemade brew, you're not just tasting honey or barley, you're tasting the air, soil, and microbes of your own corner of the world, just as ancient people did. So raise a cup to the past, it's never been closer. The secrets of Bronze Age drinks don't just hide in recipes, they're etched into the very pottery that held them. Archaeologists have become liquid detectives, analyzing microscopic residues left inside ancient jars and cups. Take the tomb of King Midas in Turkey, where a spectacular discovery awaited. Among the golden treasures, researchers found a massive bronze cauldron still coated with a sticky yellow residue. Chemical analysis revealed the truth. It wasn't just any drink, but a lavish fermented cocktail of barley beer, honey mead, and grape wine spiced with saffron and turmeric. This wasn't just a beverage, it was a royal send-off meant to accompany the legendary king into the afterlife with all the opulence of his reign. But sometimes the evidence isn't hidden in tombs, it's painted on palace walls. Minoan frescoes from Crete show vivid blue monkeys offering cups of wine, while Egyptian tomb art details every step of beer making, from crushing grain to straining the mash. Even cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia read like ancient bartending manuals, with precise instructions like bake the bapia bread twice, or let the ferment sit until it sings. These aren't just pretty pictures or dry records, they're snapshots of a world where brewing was as much art as science. Then there's the science that brings these drinks back to life. In labs from Pennsylvania to Copenhagen, researchers have used residue analysis to recreate long-lost brews. One team brewed a 5,000-year-old Chinese beer recipe from residue found in Neolithic pots, a milky, slightly sour concoction made from rice, hawthorn fruit, and wild grapes. Another project resurrected a Viking ale using yeast scraped from a 200-year-old drinking horn, the oldest confirmed drink. A 9,000-year-old Chinese beer discovered at Jiahu, made from rice, honey, and fruit. Proof that fermentation isn't just ancient history, but a thread connecting us to our Neolithic ancestors. But to truly understand these drinks, we can't just study residues, we have to listen to the stories they inspired. Homer's Iliad describes wine so dark it was nearly black, while Sumerian poetry compares beer to the onrush of the Tigris and Euphrates. These weren't just descriptions, they were cultural touchstones shaping how people saw their world. When the Greek poet Alcman sang of wine dark seas, he wasn't just being poetic, he was drawing on a shared understanding of wine's deep, mysterious hues. So what's next? The answers might lie in the unlikeliest places, like the tartaric acid traces found in 8,000-year-old Georgian pottery, suggesting winemaking began centuries earlier than we thought. Or the recently discovered Scandinavian beer stones, rocks with grooves worn by generations of brewers grinding malt. Every shard, every stain, every glyph is another piece of the puzzle, waiting to tell us what and how our ancestors drank. When Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, sat down to mourn his fallen friend Enkidu, he didn't reach for water, he poured beer as an offering to the gods. This moment from the Epic of Gilgamesh isn't just poetry. It's proof that beer flowed through the veins of Mesopotamian culture. But look closer, and these ancient texts reveal something even more fascinating: the hidden hands that shaped these drinks. While kings and heroes drank in the spotlight, who was actually brewing the beer and pressing the grapes? The answer lies in the quiet corners of history, where women often held the keys to the brew house and the vineyard. Take the famous hymn to Ninkasi, etched onto clay tablets around 1800 BCE. This ode to the Sumerian beer goddess wasn't just religious verse, it was a step-by-step brewing manual, likely recited by priestesses who doubled as master brewers. In Mesopotamia, beer making was women's work, passed down through generations like a sacred trust. Even Egyptian tomb paintings show women crushing grain for beer beneath their feet, their skirts hitched up as they worked in rhythmic unison. These weren't just laborers, they were the original brewmasters, their skills so essential that divorce records from Babylon list beer brewing equipment as shared marital property. But gender roles shifted with the drink. Wine, often tied to wealth and trade, became a man's domain in many societies. Homer's Odyssey shows this divide while Odysseus's wife Penelope waits faithfully. It's the suitors who drain the wine jars dry. Greek symposiums were boys' clubs where diluted wine fueled debates and political schemes. Yet even here, exceptions bubbled up. Minoan frescoes from Crete portray women holding elaborate chalices, toasting alongside men in scenes of religious ecstasy. And let's not forget the enigmatic Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the world's first named author, who likely oversaw temple beer production as high priestess. What's striking is how these roles reflected broader societal currents. In cultures where beer was everyday sustenance, women controlled its production. But as drinks became status symbols like aged wines or spiced meads, men often took the reins. The divide wasn't always neat. Celtic queens like Boudica famously led warriors with mead horns in hand, while Etruscan women drank freely alongside their husbands, scandalizing Greek observers. The real surprise, how much these ancient attitudes still echo today. The craft beer revolution has seen women reclaim their historic role as brewers, while sommeliers are smashing wine's old boys club reputation. When you see a modern brewer reviving a Sumerian recipe or a winemaker using clay amphorae, they're not just making drinks, they're stirring a pot that's been simmering for millennia. And that's a toast worth raising. Festive drinking in the Bronze Age wasn't just about celebration. It was a force that shaped politics, religion, and even the boundaries between life and death. Picture a Minoan harvest festival where wine flowed so freely that frescoes show worshippers dancing with cups in hand, their faces alight with ecstasy. Or imagine a Norse midwinter feast where the first sip of mead from a shared horn sealed oaths that would bind warriors for life. These gatherings weren't casual parties, they were sacred acts of community where the rules of everyday life softened and the gods felt near enough to taste. The connection between festivity and divine favor was strongest in Mesopotamia, where the Akitu festival marked the new year with 12 days of revelry. Priests poured libations of beer to honor Enki, god of wisdom, while crowds feasted on stew served in bread bowls, edible vessels that doubled as cups for communal beer. In Egypt, the Feast of Drunkenness celebrated the goddess Hathor's wrath-turned mercy, with temple rituals requiring participants to drink until they saw her celestial form. Even children joined, sipping weak beer as musicians played harps and sistrums. The message was clear: intoxication could be a bridge to the divine, but only within carefully orchestrated rituals. Yet not all festive drinking was solemn. The Greek komos, a raucous procession following symposiums, often spilled into streets with drinkers singing, dancing, and sometimes vandalizing property in Dionysian abandon. Roman Saturnalia turned social hierarchies upside down as masters served slaves spiced wine in a temporary reversal of roles. Even the Celts, whose feasts could last days, used mead to fuel bardic competitions where poets dueled with words as sharply as warriors with swords. What's fascinating is how these customs mirrored societal values. In egalitarian cultures like the Minoans, festive cups circulated freely among men and women. But in patriarchal societies, drinking spaces often divided along gender lines. Think of Greek women celebrating the dysmorphoria with wine, while their husbands drank separately at symposiums. Some festivals even had gender-specific drinks. Hittite women toasted with fruit wines during childbirth rituals, while men marked military victories with barley beer. The real magic of these ancient festivities, they remind us that drinking was never just about the liquid, it was about the bonds forged in shared moments of abandon. When a Mycenaean king raised a golden rhyton at a feast, he wasn't just pouring wine, he was weaving loyalty, piety, and joy into something as tangible as the cup itself. And that's a tradition that still lives every time we clink glasses today. Celebrations in the Bronze Age weren't complete without drinks flowing as freely as the music, but this wasn't just about indulgence. Every sip served a purpose, binding communities together in ways we've almost forgotten. Take the Minoans of Crete, whose vibrant frescoes capture wine-fueled harvest festivals where dancing figures raise cups to the gods. Their celebrations weren't chaotic free-for-alls, they were carefully choreographed rituals. The wine, often mixed with herbs or seawater for flavor, was poured from ornate vessels shaped like bulls or octopuses, each design echoing the island's sacred symbols. Meanwhile, far to the north, Celtic chieftains hosted legendary mead feasts in torchlit halls. Passing a communal drinking horn wasn't just tradition, it was a test of trust, as refusing a sip could spark deadly feuds. But behind the revelry lay surprising layers of regulation. The Code of Hammurabi, etched in stone around 1750 BC, included strict rules about taverns, like holding brewers accountable for watering down beer or overcharging. In Egypt, temple beer was rationed by rank during festivals, with workers receiving set amounts based on their role. Even the Norse, famous for their raucous mead halls, had unspoken laws. A Viking host who served spoiled mead risked dishonor, while guests who overindulged faced fines or exile. These weren't arbitrary rules, they were the glue holding fragile social order together amid intoxication's chaos. The most fascinating controls were often invisible. In Mycenaean Greece, wine served at state banquets came from royal vineyards, its quality a silent demonstration of power. Hittite treaties specified exact quantities of wine for ceremonial toasts, diplomacy measured in amphorae. And let's not forget the spiritual safeguards. Many cultures diluted wine with water, not just to moderate effects, but because undiluted drinks were reserved for the gods. A Greek mixing bowl or crater wasn't just practical, it was a boundary between mortal and divine indulgence. What emerges is a world where celebration and control danced together. From the shared beer jars of Mesopotamian weddings to the funerary feasts where Egyptians poured libations for the dead, drinking rituals were as structured as they were spirited. The next time you raise a glass at a party, remember, you're part of a tradition that's been balancing joy and judgment for millennia. Drinking in the Bronze Age wasn't a free-for-all, it came with rules as complex as the drinks themselves. Take the Code of Hammurabi, etched in stone around 1750 BC. This wasn't just about theft or property disputes. It had sharp words for tavern keepers who watered down beer or overcharged customers. Get caught cheating, and you'd face a punishment as harsh as drowning, proof that fair trade in ale was serious business in Mesopotamia. But it wasn't just about commerce. In Egypt, temple beer rations were doled out with bureaucratic precision, scribes recording every jar to ensure workers got their due without overindulgence. Even the Norse, with their legendary mead halls, had unspoken laws. A guest who spilled another's drink might owe reparations in silver, while a host serving spoiled mead risked social exile. Religious taboos added another layer. While Bronze Age cultures largely saw alcohol as sacred, some drew sharp lines around its use. The Hittites reserved certain wines for temple rituals, believing ordinary drinkers who sipped them risked divine wrath. In Judah, later Jewish texts describe strict rules for wine touched by non-believers, a precursor to kosher laws, reflecting fears of spiritual contamination. Meanwhile, Zoroastrian priests in Persia condemned public drunkenness as a tool of chaos, arguing that only ritualized, moderate drinking honored the divine. But here's what's surprising. These laws often reveal more about social anxieties than the drinks themselves. Greek city-states like Sparta banned undiluted wine not just for sobriety's sake, but because losing control threatened military discipline. Assyrian texts warn women against taverns, less out of temperance and more to police gender roles. Even the famed Roman censors, who could strip citizens of status for public drunkenness, were less concerned with morality than with maintaining political order. Why does this ancient rulebook matter today? Because every modern debate about alcohol, from drinking ages to DUI laws, echoes these Bronze Age tensions between freedom and control, sacred and profane, indulgence and responsibility. The next time you see a bouncer checking ID or a bartender cutting someone off, remember, humanity's been negotiating this balance for millennia, and just like our ancestors, we're still figuring it out one cup at a time.